Hi everyone and welcome. Today we're joined by Benjamin Abelow, a historian, foreign policy analyst, and author of an excellent book with the title How the West Brought War to Ukraine. So welcome to the program.
Thanks, Glenn. Glad to be here.
So this book has received praise from some big names, Robert F. Kennedy, Jack Matlock, John Mersheimer, and other great names. I did love the title though, the How the West Brought War to Ukraine, because it's something we're not supposed to or be discussing. That is the extent to which the West was involved in this war in terms of provoking the war. And I can imagine that the title itself was met with some hostile opposition.
Well, I definitely I had in mind when I chose that title, and I spent a lot of time trying to think about it, that my theory with writing sometimes is that I want people to be able to understand the thesis and to feel provoked by it, no matter how little or how much of the book they read. So I chose a title that I thought would, in some small way, actually make the case that I'm trying to make. And then I actually added an overview right at the beginning, which is almost like an abstract for an academic article, but written for a general audience. The thought is, well, maybe someone's going to just look at the very beginning of the book and they won't continue. Let me, in a sense, lay down the gauntlet and challenge them in a way that I thought might encourage them to keep reading. So I tried to pick the title. I selected the format in a way that I thought would keep drawing people in and try to present a credible case, even to people who might really have been opposed to it to start with.
Yeah, because one of the amazing things in this war is that we have now complete and total conformity in the media and well, political media establishment, that this war was unprovoked. And again, there's not this consensus wasn't really formed based on an open debate where we kind of reached a consensus. Rather, we see that any reference to, for example, NATO provoking this war is met with very fierce attacks. That is, yeah, one would be a Putinist, argued that one supports the invasion, one would hate Ukraine. So again, the premise have to be accepted in order to be accepted into polite society, which is the premise that this was unprovoked. So so discussing the contribution of the West, how we brought this war to Ukraine, it's I think a very important part of breaking with some of this narrative, which is quite dangerous. But on that topic, though, why was the narrative important for NATO? The narrative of this being unprovoked and it, being a third party, not involved in any way. Why was this narrative so important for NATO to push the war?
Yeah, it's very interesting. I mean, I don't have a clear understanding of why this view was adopted. Of course, many people have put forward ideas that this was, you know, a deliberate attempt to provoke a war. Some have argued somewhat more in a softer way that this was, it was a defensive attempt, but that it actually had the effect of unintended effect of provoking a war. So I don't try to take a stand on that specific issue in the book. I mean, it's clear that NATO expansion, whatever the intentions were, was, in my view, the main provocation. But there were others. There was a militarization of Ukraine outside of the NATO framework. There was, of course, the internal conflict in Ukraine with the far right and the support of the far right by the United States. And of course, the funding and support of the Maidan. Uh, even with the Maidan, though, I've tried to have a somewhat circumspect view, both because I'm not 100% sure myself, and also because I wanted to not take too extreme a position to rule out. Certainly some of the work that Ivan Kachanowski has done and that he's quoted, raises the question of whether the West might have actually in some way incited the Maidan massacre, in terms of an unnamed Western individual communicating with some of the senior people on the far right and basically saying, it would take the death of 100 people before we really came on board with this. And then, of course, that's more or less what happened. So, but I don't know how well verified that is, so I try not to take a position on that. But yeah, but certainly the narrative is essential, because everything the West is trying to do is based on the narrative that this was a deliberate war of expansion, that Putin is a Hitlerian kind of figure. And if that premise is questioned or debunked in any serious way, then the entire premise of the war falls apart. Because then you're basically, my background, Glenn, I have a kind of varied background. I have a medical degree, and I often look at it in a very kind of simplistic medical way. I think, if you are diagnosing a problem and you diagnose the problem correctly in a medical context, you're going to apply a treatment which is completely messed up. You will not only not help the situation, unless you're just extremely lucky and you happen to guess it in some way, but you're very likely to make the situation much worse, and you may kill the patient. So I didn't go into this kind of framework in the book, but I often for myself just think of this as a ridiculous misdiagnosis with all the terrible consequences that follow from it. And, just again, coming back to the way I structured the book, I called the introduction How the Narrative Drives the War. And I tried to lay this point out right at the beginning, that this war is about the narrative, that if Putin really is a Hitler type character, well, then maybe the war makes some sense. But is he? And then I basically argue by laying out other causes of the war that I think are actually the real causes.
No, I think this diagnosis approach is good, because I often made the same argument that if you believe that Putin is the new Hitler, Russia is determined not just to conquer Ukraine but all of Europe, is restoring the Soviet Union. If this is really unprovoked and Russia won't stop, then of course the solution will be then, well, we have to be very careful. Then we can't really any negotiation or settlement could only embolden further, and so instead we should send more weapons, more guns, and make sure that the cost versus the benefit of this unprovoked attack would be, that equation would be to such an extent that this war would essentially teach Russia a lesson. So again, send as much weapons as possible. It would make sense. But if the diagnosis is wrong, because the counter hypothesis here is that Russia was provoked, that Russia saw this as a threat to its existence. Now, if this diagnosis is correct, then the last thing you should do is send more weapons, because under no circumstance would Russia capitulate in a war war for its existence. So any weapons we send will only escalate, and Russia would punch much harder. And and it would confirm Russia's concern that the West is out to destroy it. And the consequence would be also that Ukraine would be destroyed. So getting the diagnosis is important before one looks at the policy. But this is why I think your book is very important, because if we don't look at if we don't get the diagnosis correctly, then we're destroying Ukraine and running towards nuclear war. So but this is why it's so frustrating, because if you're not even allowed anymore, and in Europe you're not allowed to discuss this. I mean, we have politicians now saying that, suggesting that NATO provoked this war is Russian propaganda, and then you will have your career destroyed if you repeat what is now argued by the government to be Russian propaganda. But I thought we can start with the provoked, because in your book you start with the provocations going back until the Cold War coming to an end, then the Soviet Union dissolving. So you start from the 1990s, first looking at the pre-war era from 1990 to 2014. What were the main provocations, though, from your perspective?
Well, I think certainly the assurances, as they're sometimes called, that were given to Russia or given to the Soviet Union at that time, about not expanding NATO. I looked into that and I discuss it in the book. And I think probably you, of course, and most of your guests are probably familiar with the documents of the National Security Archive of George Washington University, the writings of Joshua Shifrinson, um, and other documented sources that are really clear that assurances were given. This is not just a matter of Baker's, a one-off statement by Baker, but there were a number of statements by Baker, but there were many, many others by many Western leaders. And yes, it wasn't part of uh, any formal agreement that associated with the removal of Soviet forces from East Germany, but it's very clear that that there were assurances that were given. Mark Trachtenberg has written some wonderful material on this notion of a requirement for written agreement, and how that just is not actually accurate in terms of how diplomatic history works. These are all points that you've made too. Anyway, my point there is simply that this was not the single decisive element in the in what's happened, but this dishonesty on the part of the West, I think, laid a foundation of growing skepticism on the part of the Russian leaders. And then, of course, with the expansion of NATO that first initially happened, in 1997, but, really it seems like the path was set probably as early as 1994, if I'm not mistaken. But then the continued expansion, and then finally with the attempt by George Bush to bring in Ukraine and NATO, which was Ukraine and Georgia, but Ukraine especially was always a red line, and this is evident, of course, from the writing, from the this memo and the cable and the subsequent confidential email from Burns in 2008, but many others. One of the points that I highlight in the in the book is that, and this is, I think, one that's often not brought to bear, is that, it was either in late 2007 or 2008, we don't know, but the National Intelligence Council of the U.S. Actually came out with a position that if the U.S. tried to bring Ukraine into NATO, that a number of things might happen. It was not an affirmative statement that they will, but it was really making it very clear that these were all seriously considered by the U.S. National Intelligence Council, and that these included, not just the taking of Crimea, but the actual invasion of Ukraine proper. And so to me, it's very striking, and this is part of the strong case, I think, that can be made that about the actual causes of this war is that 8 years or so before the taking of Crimea, or the annexation, or however you want to describe it, or the reacquisition, people have different framings of that. But 8 years before that, and a full 14 or 15 years before the 2022 war, this very senior U.S. national intelligence body, the National Intelligence Council, was actually warning about these exact outcomes, and they came to pass. Not everyone's familiar with the National Intelligence Council. This is, one of the key national intelligence bodies, but their particular function is to synthesize intelligence information and provide them to other branches of government. It's really remarkable that this document existed. Fiona Hill was involved with the National Intelligence Council at that time. And, of course, she's best known as being an extreme hawk and actually arguing that NATO had nothing to do with this. But she herself has on a number of occasions made very clear that she thinks NATO does have to do with it. And I actually, an interview that she gave right at the start of this 2022 war in Politico, at the very same time that she's sort of arguing NATO has nothing to do with it, she's talking about the National Intelligence Council document or position. And at the same time, she's really asserting a position very much like John Mearsheimer, that if the U.S. proceeded with what it was doing, Ukraine would be wrecked. She doesn't use the word wrecked, but she uses a term like, dismembered or spread apart or things like this. So that even Fiona Hill was very clear on what could happen. And one of the things I do in my chapter 5 is try to compare what Fiona Hill actually said at the start of this war with what John Mearsheimer said. And I said, they're basically the same thing. And the idea that Fiona Hill can actually sustain a position of that NATO had nothing to do with this, I find quite incredible. This is, my opinion, of course, but, readers of the book can form their own opinion, or those who have read her, I think it was February 28th, 2022 interview in Politico. This is where the particular statement that I'm referring to comes from. People can, at least last I checked, that was still available online, and can simply read that and then mentally compare it with Mearsheimer's positions.
Like, yeah, I liked how you in the book did weigh them against each other because, well, also from only looking at Fiona Hill, it is interesting that the assessments they make versus the narrative they have to fit, that you see the same people almost at the same time, more or less contradicting themselves. But a lot of the material comes from, as you said, the 1990s.
Yeah.
And you cite people like George Kennan and others who warned very strongly against this. But another time period, of course, for many where this is to find a lot of sources where there's predictions about the possible consequences would be 2008. That is at the Bucharest summit in April of 2008, when the decision was made to promise future membership for Ukraine.
Yeah.
What do you think this? Well, what kind of information or conclusions do you get from this period?
Yeah. I already referred to William Burns and the release of his cables and cable and email through WikiLeaks. It's very clear what some of the most senior people in the U.S. government were thinking and concerned about at that time. And that was actually the time that the National Intelligence Council position was taken. It was late 2007, early 2008. So I think the documentation is very good there, that this is a major incitement. There was an article in Der Spiegel which went into some detail about the 2008 summit and talking about the relationships between Rice and Bush and the French and German leaders. And it was very clear that everyone was strongly opposed to this, that they really understood that this would be perceived by Russia as, I think as John Mearsheimer has emphasized, that there's statements from that this could be perceived as an act of war. One of the things that's really remarkable that I think also maybe is not always emphasized enough is people will sometimes talk about the Bucharest Memorandum, which, they did not give a membership action plan, which is what Bush, as I understand it, wanted. But due to the opposition of the German and the French, that no membership action plan was given. So it's sometimes argued, well, look, there was no membership action plan. There was no real danger. This was not pushing too hard. But if you go to the Bucharest Memorandum for that year, for 2008, and just search Ukraine, it's all contained in one paragraph. I think it may be contained in paragraph 23, if I recall. But either way, just do a word search on that page, and you read the paragraph. It's actually very clear just how strong a statement that was. It's actually a statement saying that the whole thing could be reevaluated within 6 months. I think they actually gave a date like September or December 2008, that the entire decision could be reworked in 2008. And so, yes, no membership action plan was given, and that was a walk back to some extent by the U.S. But the statement, I think, is actually much stronger than most people realize. To me, it looked pretty darn threatening. And that if if in fact it's the case, which I think is certainly the case, that Russia felt threatened by this, that was I almost viewed it as somewhere between the way it's usually quoted, will become a member of NATO, and a membership action plan, because it clearly emphasized a time frame, and it was a quick time frame within which it sounded like a membership action plan could be given.
And yeah, the Bucharest summit of 2008, it also, well, a conclusion would be then that even if the Europeans wouldn't want to bring Ukraine immediately into NATO, as this could be seen as as a declaration of war against Russia. Those were the words by Angela Merkel at the time.
Yeah.
That was nonetheless the recognition that, well, this could be done incrementally through this, small step by step. So making Ukraine effectively a de facto member of NATO, gradually decouple it from Russia, bring it closer and closer into the NATO orbit, and then until the point where it becomes a mere formality, or it can't really be prevented. But in your book you go on after this period up to 2014.
Yeah.
Which again, if we go back to the 90s, this was not controversial to argue that NATO expansion would be provocative. But in 2014, you have this, the toppling of the government with the support of the West in Kiev, and Russia retaliates or responds. It takes over Crimea, and I guess offers limited support to Donbass. It doesn't support its secession. But what is it that you see happening between when the war began in 2014 and up until the Russian invasion in 8 years later in 2022?
Yeah. Let me just go back. I do want to address what you're saying, but let me go back one step further, which something I didn't bring up or we didn't discuss which also runs into that period. But, starting in 2002, there was the U.S. abrogation or withdrawal, at least, from very important arms control treaties. In late 2001, early 2002, there was withdrawal from the ABM treaty. And then, of course, there was, subsequent withdrawal from the in I guess it was 2019 or was it 2017? Sometimes mix it up, of the INF treaty. And so that these, the question, whole progression of nuclear arms treaty was also very important, because it's very clear that Russia had legitimate concerns about a first strike. Not so much that they were convinced that the U.S. actually could carry out a first strike effectively, but a legitimate concern that some leaders in the U.S. might think they could, and therefore might attempt it. This is often a point that's, I think very important to bring out, because it's both sides, I would say, really exhibit a kind of paranoia. But some of that paranoia, I think they both recognize that an actual first strike is not possible, but that they both have concerns that the other side might think that. Anyway, you were asking specifically about, since from 2014 on,
Sorry, just one more quick thing on the
yeah,
the canceling the INF treaty in 2019. The missile defense system was President Dmitry Medvedev, who said back in 2011, I think, that if it would ever reach the potential of actually being able to successfully intercept Russia's retaliatory capabilities after a U.S. first strike, if it reached that level, that Russia would likely strike these missile components and in preemptive strike, or preventive maybe. But either way, this is something we often very dismissive of, how great of concern it was. And I think you, as you correctly said, not only is this a concern that it would translate or convert nuclear weapons from a defensive weapon, that is as a deterrent, to a potentially offensive weapon by being then capable of intercepting the retaliatory capabilities, but also the the escalatory control one would have. Well, we can see this now during this proxy war. The sense of comfort of just launching missiles towards Russian cities. One assumes on both sides then that if American leaders would be under the conviction or believe to some extent that they would have some first strike capabilities, that they would act more aggressively, and also assuming therefore that the Russians would have to fold or capitulate if the US only brought enough pressure on it. So this idea of dominating the escalation ladder, it's very much at the front and center of what the Russians expressed concerns about. Anyways,
Yeah.
sorry I interrupted you.
No, it's an excellent point. The question of using a threat, or even a theoretical threat, or even just convincingly communicating the view that one believes one can carry out a first strike, that this can contribute to a kind of coercive pattern in the conventional realm, or an attempt to use the nuclear coercion in that realm. So it's all very complicated and very dangerous when these things are being done. Um, yeah, I guess from just looking at the period from 2014 on specifically, we've already mentioned the INF Treaty, which was, a crucial treaty. And of course, the U.S. has accused Russia of cheating on that, and the Russia accused the U.S. of violating that treaty as well. And it's, without a very deep dive into it, it's hard to know 100%. But, my own impression is that certainly the U.S. probably was. The analysis I've read about the Mk-41 launchers, which is the launchers of the ABM systems that were being set up in Poland and Romania, that probably was a violation of the INF Treaty. The question about the range of some of the Russian missiles, I didn't look into as much detail, but it's possible that was a violation too. But in any case, the main point, I think, which I try to bring out in the book, is that it was the U.S. that refused to try to negotiate and to resolve these questions, and that their actual reason for withdrawal from the treaty may have had more to do with a desire to counter the growing nuclear arsenal of China, which was not covered in this agreement. It was a bilateral agreement, but it nonetheless constrained the U.S.'s ability. And then when Russia attempted not only to not reenact the treaty or resolve the treaty, but simply to come up with some sort of bilateral agreement that would not prevent the U.S. from countering China, the U.S. also refused on that. So the whole nuclear situation seemed like it was driven largely by the U.S. Um, uh, Michael McFaul, as is probably pretty well known by many people, that right after the annexation of Crimea, basically made a statement. This was reported, I believe it was in Time magazine, that this was an impulsive move by Putin, um, that was a response to the taking of Crimea. So this itself, it's sort of extraordinary that when you have someone, as I've already given the example of Fiona Hill, but you have an example now of Michael McFaul, who also is basically an extreme hawk, who's argued against the idea that NATO had anything to do with this, that this was a expansionary move by Russia, that he himself has stated that this was an impulsive move taken in response to Crimea. So starting with there, I think the evidence is clear. But then, of course, the CIA started to become actively involved. As the Times reported, something like 12 CIA bases right on Russia's border. I believe there were another 2 or more internal to Ukraine. Um, and then, the statements by the role of the U.S. in funding the Maidan, in their role in democracy promotion right along, the possibility that they were directly and knowingly involved in the promotion of the violence, certainly in their recognition of the new Ukrainian government in a way that was against the constitution of Ukraine. And then, of course, as the work of Ivan Kaczynski has emphasized very clearly, but also was very clear from a phone call between Catherine Ashton and Ormas Pate right after the Maidan events of 2014 of the Maidan massacre, having to do when that phone call was leaked. It was basically Ormas Pate, the foreign minister of Estonia, extremely hawkish regime, communicating with the senior foreign policy official of the European Union, saying that, she had heard from the primary Maidan physician, Olga, I'm forgetting her last name now, that this may well have been a false flag attack. Now, later, my understanding is she subsequently withdrew from that, but of course, what were her incentives to do that? She was probably under tremendous pressure, perhaps even threats. So the U.S. certainly played a role in the regime change. Whether they played direct role in the violence or not I find it hard to assess, but they were very involved in the process. Um, and then, I often jump next to thinking about Zelensky, uh, as is often correct and very correctly pointed out. He was elected in 2019 on a peace platform, uh, and basically said that he would, make peace even if it cost him his position. But then, of course, uh, his life was threatened publicly and more than once. And he began to withdraw from that position. But it wasn't simply the threats by the far right. It was also the role of the U.S. Individuals like William Taylor, who was active in Ukraine at that point. I believe he was the chargé d'affaires of the Ukrainian embassy at that point. I can't recall exactly. But then also Kurt Volker, who had a role as special envoy. I think both these were in 2019. And there was pressure coming from both of them not to go ahead with a peaceful resolution to the crisis in the Donbass. Um, and I think we see a gradual movement of Zelensky away from a peace platform due to threats, pressures. Um, I have to say that, you've, Glenn, posted a pretty remarkable video, a short clip, statement by Zelensky talking about how some of the Western powers would be very happy to not, not have an agreement. There have been moments I found myself wondering, is it even pressure possible that Zelensky came under some kind of pressure from the intelligence agencies in the West? I mean, this is, purely speculative. I really have no basis for that other than, you see how the CIA has operated sometimes in other contexts. So uh, I think my point here is not so much to make unsubstantiated claims about anything, but to simply say that it's very clear there were pressures on Zelensky from multiple sources that were compelling him to not follow through on the peace platform. Um, and then, of course, once the war started, one of the things that's so remarkable is that literally within 24 hours of the Russian invasion on February 24th, 2022, Russia contacted Zelensky's office and basically, laid out the key demand, which was neutrality uh, uh, with respect to NATO. Um, and then this, of course, ultimately led to the negotiations that took place, first in Belarus, but then in Istanbul. But to me, it's another, I would call it, piece of compelling evidence about what Putin's motivations were. That literally within 24 hours, they contacted the office of the Ukrainian president. One can still find this on at least again, last time I checked, on the website of the Ukrainian president, that basically describes this, in a public presentation that Zelensky made. Um, so I think the evidence really lines up that this was an attempt by Putin to carry out a policy of, I would call it, coercive diplomacy, to try to compel Ukraine to accept neutrality with respect to NATO, that he was unable to do in good measure because of all these pressures coming from the West or from the far right within Ukraine. Um, so to me, this all took place after I wrote the book. Well, I shouldn't say it all took place, but it came to light, or I became more aware of some of the things that happened after 2022. I mean, I wanted to publish this book very quickly after the war started. It was actually first published as a online essay on Medium, like 20,000 word essay on a Medium platform, and then I quickly turned it into a book and also arranged for the German publication. And that was all out by the summer of 2022, because I thought it was very important to get out quickly. But as a result, there was important things I couldn't include. And certainly one of the things I would have included that was, I think, a good deal of confirmation about what the true Russian motives were, coercive diplomacy, um, were things that happened or became evident after the book was already, in the track for publication. So,
Yeah, well, after the election of Zelensky in 2019, though, it wasn't just the far right which put pressure and threatened his life, but also NGOs, Western financed NGOs, which even published red lines for Zelensky, red lines he should not cross. And it's yeah, they're still on their website of these NGOs, and it's quite a long list of red lines. But more or less, he's not allowed to talk to negotiate with Russia without NATO countries in the room. Nothing he can do can jeopardize NATO membership in the future. And effectively, it was one long list of, yeah, going against all of his campaign promises. So yeah, it is troubling that this is also, yeah, we call it NGOs, but yeah, financed, of course, by most of the Western governments.
yeah,
Um,
just to jump in for a second, Glenn, I read your excellent piece on the Ukraine Crisis Media Center, or one among other NGOs, and it really was striking that it seemed that these NGOs, nonprofits, allegedly peaceful educational organizations, whatever they were making what were quite close to explicit threats of governmental overthrow, which I think emphasized the extent to which there really is a hand in glove relationship between some of these NGOs and governmental policies. I'm not saying all the NGOs are like that. I don't really understand the balance of more benign NGO activity, funding by USAID, versus funding of activities that are essentially arms of the military, industrial, or intelligence apparatus of the U.S. But it's pretty remarkable, some of these, what's going on. So yeah, and I actually became aware of that through your writing, which is just terrifically important.
well, what do you see, yeah, finally, about, because the war, of course, is not over. This is always a problematic thing if one writes a book about a war which is still ongoing. But what are the possible objectives here, do you see, in this war? Because it's is it simply to weaken Russia, break Russia? I mean, this is very strange because usually, if you would be fighting the world's largest nuclear power, it would be important to define victory. And I guess a key concern for many of, well, observing NATO over the past 30 years is it's very easy to get into these wars, but there tends to be some mission creep and lack of exit strategies. So again, a lot of this being failed to, yeah, link military activity up towards a clear and achievable objective. But what do you think NATO is going for here, though, in terms of the objective in this war?
Yeah. Well, I guess some of this is, the $64 million question, or $64,000 question. Um, I don't feel I have a definitive answer on that, but I maybe what I will do, if is highlight a contributing component, or what I perceive to be a contributing component, that I think helps explain some of NATO's current activities, at least, as well as some of the positions of the European leaders. I think it's impossible to know for sure, because this is sort of a psychological explanation, or it's not anything that I don't I'm not aware of anything that it can be documented. But one of the things I'm struck with about the European leaders is the question of why they are at this point doubling down. And my perception is that one of the reasons is that they so blindly followed the West. I mean, initially, Germany and France were so opposed to the expansion of NATO in 2008. And I don't know exactly when that shifted. Uh, I personally, my sense is that both Merkel and Francois Hollande, when they repudiated the uh, I guess it was the Steinmeier formula specifically for the Donbass, when they basically said, no, no, that was just a ruse. I don't really accept that. I don't buy that. I think that they became afraid to say that they were truly committed to it. But I mentioned that just to say that I think as late as uh, uh, I guess that was in 2019 that this was put forward. But until very recently, I think the European powers were opposed to what the U.S. was trying to achieve in Ukraine. Um, but at some point, they fully came on board, perhaps under Biden. Um, uh, and I think that again, this is just a guess, maybe just throw it out as a speculative hypothesis people can take or dispose of as they see fit. But that there was a feeling in Europe, my sense, that if they were to acknowledge their error, it would involve acknowledging how fully they capitulated to the US position and fully repudiated their own agency. And that therefore now, now that Trump is in and is trying to assert a somewhat different perspective on the situation, that the European leaders are afraid to acknowledge the mistake, not just because they don't want to acknowledge their mistake, but because they're afraid to demonstrate in that the extent to which they truly functioned as a vassal of the United States. And they don't want that. They want to continue to see themselves as powerful, independent actors. Again, completely speculative, but this is a thought that I have. I think maybe some of the same things could be said with NATO. That the European leaders, of course, play a central role in NATO. I mean, the U.S. is the dominant player, but the main European players are, crucially important. And I think, there could be a case to me made the same way that a kind of unwillingness to acknowledge the extent to which they were basically bullied into a position that they realized was a mistake. They don't want to admit their mistake, and they don't want to admit the extent of their subservience to the U.S. Anyway, this is the extent to which I've thought about what otherwise seems to me an impossibly crazy situation. Because to me, the evidence of what the Russian motivations actually were is completely clear. Of course, Stoltenberg himself acknowledged this. Others have acknowledged what the actual motivation of the war was. On some level, I think everyone understands this. Um, uh, and it makes no sense that they would hold to a narrative that they themselves must understand is false. So I start looking for ulterior motives for holding on to the narrative. And I do think that these kind of psychologically driven motives, can be very important. So that's some of my current thinking about that.
Yeah. I do think maybe a psychological approach is required to understand what is being done, because there's so much self-harm, and usually most of the political theories we operate with to understand the behavior of states starts with the assumption of the rational decision makers, in which maximizing your own security would be at the center. But if you look at Europe these days, it's quite extraordinary, and not just the very dangerous militarism and economic decline, but making the Europeans spectators in international affairs. I mean, from Ukraine to Iran, nobody wants them there for negotiations or anything. It's they really been put in the corner. My last question was just on one of your chapters, it's if the shoe was on the other foot, and I thought this was an interesting headline because, from my perspective, one of the key challenges or weaknesses which have developed throughout the unipolar moment was the inability or reluctance to actually address the security concerns of others. So again, what would we do if we were in the situation of the other? So what are your thoughts on the shoe on the other foot? What would we do if we were in the situation of the Russians?
Yeah, yeah, it's quite extraordinary, really, um, how this is so often just disregarded, or is seen as irrelevant or immoral, even to raise it. Um, I think that this is just how states react. Certainly, states that have the power to do what they perceive as protecting their interests, and even weaker states would do it if they had the power. I think I think it's wrong to make a distinction between a complete distinction between major players in terms of power and less major, because they're all concerned with the same types of issues, the security dilemma. Um, uh, so the U.S., I have no doubt in my mind that if something equivalent in reverse were to happen, if uh, somehow the U.S. would have a severe falling out with Canada or a severe falling out with Mexico, and then one of those countries was to become aligned with either China or Russia, and then be armed, and then carry out some of the types of military exercises, the US, I think, would have gone to war a lot faster than Russia. Um, and not simply because it had more power, but because I think it would be less able to approach things in a more rational way. I think there's, as much as I value the US in many respects, I also think that there's something going on, a kind of deep irrationality where diplomatic solutions are being delegitimized, and not simply because of the Ukraine war, but uh, it's a very dangerous situation. Apropos of this, Glenn, something I discuss in the book, but it's not always realized. In 2020 and 2021, NATO did a series of live fire missile exercises within Estonia, 90 miles from Russia's border, with missiles that had a range of about 130 miles, 180 miles, or 190 miles. I think it must have been, ATACMS, that those were. Uh, and they actually fired the missiles. They did not enter Russian airspace, but it was very openly discussed that the target of those drills was to practice an attack on Russian air defense systems, defensive systems. Um, and that was not done as part of a plan for a preemptive war, or not done as part of an attack, a plan for an aggressive war against Russia. It was done with the idea, well, what would we do, the West, if Russia invaded the Baltics? One of the first things we would do would be try to destroy Russian air defense systems so that we have a more of a clear path to attack some of the offensive forces. But my God, what would the U.S. do if Russia started firing off missiles 90 miles from the U.S. border, with the stated intention of destroying air defense targets in, let's say, Minnesota, um, and then saying, well, we really were not looking to have an offensive threat. We were just thinking of this as part of a defensive strategy. I mean, the U.S. would have just, this would have not have been taken seriously, and it would have led to war. Um, so I think it's very important to think of putting the shoe on the other foot. Again, I think these psychological factors come into play. Um, People are, uh, so afraid of, quote unquote, backing down, that the security dilemmas always tend to, I can't say always, but there's a tendency for security dilemmas to lead to escalation, as opposed to recognizing that the real danger is the escalation within the security dilemma. Um, uh, and I think this is an area where I probably see things somewhat differently from some of the more the realists of the more offensive school, which kind of argues that it's rational. If I'm understanding their work correctly, I've not read it in as much depth as I should, but that the tendency is that uh, the rational approach within a security dilemma is to escalate um, because of the threats. And I think that's a logical flaw in that school of realism. I think that a truly rational approach would be to give equal or more weight to the risk of escalation. Um, uh, but that for some reason, perhaps because of the psychological factors at play, countries often will escalate instead of recognize the danger, but that on a theoretical level, it may be a mistake to speak about the need for dominance or regional dominance or whatever in terms of a rational mindset within a realist framework. I would question that. I hope that's clear. I'm not sure I expressed that so well, but
No, it makes sense. And well, it's just general the inability to see things from the other side. As you said, that the US will probably react in a very similar way. And indeed, you can also add to this list between 2019 and 2021, people like the advisor of Zelensky, Arestovich. He was making very open arguments that we were training with NATO for preparation for war with Russia. And we just finished a war now with Iran, in which it was a surprise attack was launched upon Iran. And when asked for justification, one of the common themes is, well, they said death to America. This is unacceptable on the other side of the planet. Yeah, imagine another great power on your border doing war exercises against you. It's no, it's quite extraordinary.
yeah.
But
And of course, often very little recognition that, this was a pattern that was initiated by the West in 53, that's started off with a kind of ill will or sense of threat that, in some ways is actually analogous, I think, to what happened in 1991 with Russia and the West with repudiation of assurances. It created it initiated a dynamic that had many other features to it, of course, but that it started things off in a bad direction, one of increased suspicion and the like.
well, Benjamin Abelow, thank you so much for your time. We went a little bit over there, but no, thank you. And I would also, advise anyone watching. Very much recommend the book "How the West Brought War to Ukraine," and I'll leave a link as well to in the description for the book on Amazon. So
Yeah,
thank you
great.
again for your time.
Thank you, Glenn. By the way, I think I may have sent you before, but the book is continuing to sell. I mean, I think it's in Germany, for instance. I think it's #1 right now in political history, political science, maybe international relations textbooks. So I'm not doing this because the book is crashing. It's continuing to do surprisingly well in some markets, but and in Italy too, is just coming out now with an audiobook. It just was published in Bulgarian. But I've nonetheless decided to make the German, English, and French editions PDFs available free of charge as downloads, just to try to get the word out. So I will, if I haven't already, I'll send you a link to the download page. People are welcome to just either circulate that link if they care to, or download a PDF themselves. I mean, of course, it's much nicer to read a print copy, and I don't object to making a few dollars for my efforts. But for me, the most important thing is to try to get the word out and in a sort of a compact, readable way that makes a strong case, a strong and credible case for a position that's quite different from what many of us have been hearing lately. So please feel free to post the free link as well.
Yeah, sure. Okay. Well, that's even better. So go to the description and get the book for free. So
Yeah.
thanks again.
Okay. Thanks, Glenn.